How you guys doing? There you go. That's a boisterous crowd for this hour of the day. So I got in very late last night. I'm a little confused. Please be kind. Be nice to me instead of each other.
James is usually confused. He's just admitting it.
Oh, come on. Come on.
We want to talk about principle versus outcome. We write 50 op-eds plus a year, have been doing for a number of years. And we get lots of hate mail. And the hate mail that we get is invariably focusing on outcome when what we want to talk about is principle. And we've found that much of the vitriol you get between the left and the right today, people just not talking to each other, or when they do, talking past each other and immediately goes to ad hominem, arises from this phenomenon. The people aren't talking about principles, they're talking about outcomes. So you pick some topic, one of the ones that we've pointed out that libertarians are not of a single mind on, and yet they can talk about reasonably, is abortion. Now, we're not here to talk about the topic, but rather how we go about talking about it. Libertarians tend to start from principles, that a person owns themselves, that life is part of that ownership. Whereas those on the left and the right jump to the end, and they're talking about what happens. Well, the effect on the woman or the effect on the child. And the problem with starting the discussion at the outcome is that you got the whole thing backwards. And you can easily end up contradicting yourself. Good case in point is California. Recently, California passed 2 laws in the past 6 months. One said that boards of directors have to include a certain fraction of females. And this is an outcome-driven decision. So somebody, somewhere, or a group of somebodies, said this isn't right that we don't have enough female representation on boards of directors, so let's pass this law. Every board of directors has to include so many females. Okay, that's fine. But then they passed this other law, and again focused on outcome. And this law said, and passed by, I would imagine, much of the same people, said that an individual should be able to declare his or her or its own gender without submitting any evidence, supporting the fact. In other words, if I want to say I'm a male or if I want to say I'm a female, I can simply say so, and legally, under California law, that is my gender.
Give you one guess what's going to happen with the first law, right?
Right.
And here's your problem right there in a nutshell. And as Ant and I write, and we do write a lot, I think we're always in the process of writing an article or working on a podcast, right? So we're always churning through these things. I remember when we started this a lot of years ago. I think, haven't we known each other 9 years now? I think we've been working together 9 years. Best 6 months of my life. And I remember when we met, we decided that we had, as people like us who teach in colleges and who've studied things for decades tend to do, we had rather pronounced views on things. We had certain what we would call beliefs. But we made this deal with each other. At the time we met, I remember it, I think it was the night we started talking about doing this, that wherever the data and the good arguments went, that's where we went to. And if it turned out that we were radically incorrect in our presuppositions about things, we would change our minds on the spot and write it for the public and put it right out there. Right? That we wouldn't seize on outcome-based thinking. That it would always be principled thinking. And if it turns out we got a principle wrong, or more likely misunderstood a principle, we would work on it until we understood it better, but we'd be perfectly transparent about it. And I think I've changed my mind a number of times.
Yeah, I could give you a good example. It's probably the most earth-shattering mind change I've had, which is for many, many years, I was a staunch anarchist, and I still just love the anarchist philosophy, and I wish it were right. And for years, I would argue with James, no, you're absolutely wrong, because he would argue, he's a political scientist, right? No government has a role. I said, that's nonsense. Everything the government does can be done by the private sector, period. And so we would have this discussion. This went on for years, until one day we're having this discussion, and he says, look, empirically, there has never been a society in human history that hasn't evolved some form of government. Now, to me, being an econometrician, data-driven, that was a compelling piece of evidence. And so, yeah, I have to give up. Say, yeah, I can't be an anarchist anymore because it doesn't comport with what we have observed. Now, I would love at some point to find a counter-argument to that, but until such time, I've got to admit, yeah, I don't think the anarchist position is correct.
And in the interest of not having the room launch on me, I'm not a fan of government. I just, following from Aristotle, I suspect it's inevitable, whether it manifests in the form of an institutional government or some form of raw authority or even some form of gentle authority. It's just inevitable is all. Now, on my side, I think I've probably not had wholesale changes like that, but down the list, right, you start having somebody who knows better. I can't believe I'm complimenting him like this. Somebody who knows better than you do about things like economic data. The one thing that Anthony does truly well, right? He's like a savant, it's amazing. And when he says, no, this is what will happen if we were to do X with Social Security moving forward. And then he lays out the numbers and you think, well, all right, I have to reformulate because my preferred outcome doesn't match human experience or the expectation of theory. And when that comes to be true, you have to adjust. That's on you. And when you dig your heels in, as so many people do, really what ends up happening is, Ant said earlier, you talk past each other, but I think it's worse than that. I think what really happens is that people think the worst of each other. Mm-hmm. And when you think the worst of each other, the possibility that you'll find any hope for compromise utterly disappears. And I make this joke with my undergraduate students all the time. I mean, I say, do you really think that Republicans wake up in the morning and say, how can we make children more stupid? Because that's the argument you get coming out of the left on education spending. If you'd prefer it from the other side, do you really think Democrats wake up every morning and say, how can we make America less safe? Let's fix it so we all get attacked. And I suspect they don't think that either. So I think when you sit back and really consider it, I'm not willing to dismiss the motives of people who disagree with me pretty significantly. I think their motives are generally quite decent and quite pure because I think people are generally quite decent, not universally, but generally. So it's got to be something else. So what's driving us here?
And the problem with starting a conversation at outcomes is you miss all of that commonality. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and the context of the conversation was not libertarian, so I'm presenting this as Republican versus Democrat. And we were arguing about the welfare state. And what was eye-opening for this person is because this person was used to having the conversation in terms of outcome. Should we have the welfare state? Should we not? And what was clearly eye-opening for this person is when I phrased it as, look, people on the left regard government as a complement to society, whereas people on the right tend to regard government as a substitute for society. So when people on the left say we should have more government, and people on the right are helping the poor, and people on the right say we should have less government helping the poor, they're both talking about the same thing. They both mean we should help the poor. The one side is viewing government as an aid to that. The other side is viewing government as an impediment to that. But if you drill down to the principle, both sides want to help the poor. Start at the principle, don't start at the outcome. And you immediately have a point of agreement. Left and right, we can agree we want to help the poor. And now we go down James' path. We ask, where does the data, where does logic lead us?
That's not my path, that's your path.
I'm attributing it
That's
to you.
really clever what you did there.
You go down the path of logic and data and you ask what has worked. And what can you argue will work?
I feel like I'm talking to my wife here.
Why?
Because she often says, remember when it was your idea that we do this? just like you just did. And the real danger here is that, I'm just moving right along. The real danger here is what emerges all the time, right? One group calling the other stupid, that first group calling the other one evil. And do you really think that's true? I think everybody's kind of stupid some of the time. And I think most people can be evil a little bit of the time. But generally speaking, I don't think either one of those things is true in the least. So how can we frame our arguments? What can we do to become more persuasive to all of them? Because here's the really bad news. Those two groups argue with each other, and we argue with all of them. And we're losing badly. And it's pretty easy to see it anywhere you look.
One of the interesting places to start a conversation and to show goodwill to the other side is the question, what do we owe each other? Because libertarians will tend to fall on the side of, well, we don't owe each other anything. Not in a selfish way, but in the sense of, I own myself, I own what I produce, you own yourself, you own what you produce. I don't have any claim on your stuff, and conversely, you don't have any claim on mine. And there's a compelling argument there. However, it doesn't go to the extreme. We live in a society. We're social creatures, and as social creatures, we do owe each other something. It's not 100% of what we have, but nor is it zero. And one of the things particularly we as free market types have to be careful of is in pushing the idea of private property, not to say I have any problem with it, but in pushing it to an antagonistic audience. Be very careful that you don't appear that you're going to the extreme of we owe each other nothing. Because empirically, that's not the case. And more than that, I don't think logically you can make a good argument that that's the case. That if we live in society, we do indeed owe each other something. Now, what is it between 0 and 100%? I don't know. But I know it's not either one of those extremes. And I think once you admit that, you give the other person some not verification, what am I looking for? Affirmation. Affirmation that you aren't dismissing their position out of hand. And once you give the person affirmation, they understand, yes, you see some truth in what their position is. You can then more easily come to some meeting of the minds.
Ant said earlier that we get a lot of hate mail, and that hate mail comes almost entirely from the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, which is easily the meanest of all the American cities I have ever been to. And we have a monthly column in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it generates a lot of hatred because, let's just say, our point of view isn't appreciated there. And then you sit back and you think, well, that is a city that booed Santa Claus. Right? The football fans in the room know that Santa Claus was literally assaulted at RFK Stadium during an Eagles game. So if they'll assault Santa, they'll probably come after you. I think nobody's really safe here. But when we say things like, we owe each other something, and Ant and I say this a lot, that's when we get hate mail from libertarians.
Right.
And the Randians come out, and they're very hostile. But if you're an American constitutionalist, right, a strict constructionist even, and you realize that when you read the Constitution, there are things like courts of law, there are things like post offices and post roads, right, these little things. Well, even on the most minor of levels, there will be a shared cost. And we're going to have to bear that cost somehow. So broadly construed, if you look at it from this perspective, we do owe each other something. And like Ant, I'm not comfortable saying that I'm sure what it is. I'm not. But I do know it to be something. And we can talk about human decency and those sorts of things that we owe each other. But really, we're talking about the dollar figure when we talk about it in this way. And I'm not at all clear on the matter. I think we've done some strange work on this. And it seems that if you ask the American people what they think they owe each other, you get a rather common answer, and it's about 20 to 25% of their income. Mm-hmm. They settle right in at it. I don't know why they settle right in at that, but they do. And it turns out that's about what they pay, actually, more or less. And we divide this up a lot in the articles and talk about it, so I'll refer you to those if you want any specifics. But it's interesting that most people perceive the world in this way, and the answer you get from them when you ask is, I owe something, but it's not most of what I make. It's not even close to most to what I make, but it's not insignificant either. And Ant talks about this a lot, and rightfully so. We seem to have a federal tax tolerance of about 18%. You might want to talk about that for a minute.
If you can look through history going back to roughly the 1960s, and what you find is federal tax receipts. Receipts is an interesting term. It's a technical term. It means all federal government revenue from all sources combined. So you're talking about payroll taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, capital gains, tariffs, the whole bit. Every piece of money the federal government collects, we call that federal receipts. Federal receipts have been an amazingly constant 18% of GDP for the past 60 years. And it doesn't matter. You could superimpose it. You see this graph. It is like a horizontal line. I describe it as the most interesting graph in economics because it looks so boring. You superimpose on top of this horizontal line the top marginal tax rate. When we taxed the rich at 92%, the federal government collected 18% of the economy's GDP, 18% of the economy's tax revenue. When in the Reagan years, we dropped that to like 32%. The federal government collected 18% of the economy as GDP. Capital gains tax rates, when they were high, when they were low, same 18%. All sorts of things. What else do we collect? The tariffs, the payroll taxes, everything else. It's constantly the same. So what that indicates, I don't know why it's the case, but it is the case. And what it seems to indicate is that there's something involved, be it something at the congressional level where Congress gives with one hand and takes away with the other, something at the economy level where people are reacting in such a way as to give you this result. But whatever it is, empirically, we seem to have this tolerance of 18% of GDP, and that's it. That's what the federal government gets.
And this is actually more funny than you might think, because I think it's probably not Congress, and we have some evidence for this. Ant and I, once we realized this and started unpacking what it meant, we started writing about it and we started making predictions about it. And it turns out we outpredicted the Congressional Budget Office by leaps and bounds. We did way better than the Congressional Budget Office. So much so that a number of congressmen had their staff get on a conference call with us so we might explain how we did a better job than the CBO. And the first question they ask is, how big is your staff? And we said, staff? What? It's just me, Ant, and the dog. And you could tell by the pause after we answered that question that they weren't believing it. And then they said, how do you arrive at such an accurate number? Because the Congressional Budget Office cannot predict almost anything. And whenever it drifts into this territory, it gets things completely wrong.
And they're off by a factor of like 1.7.
Yeah, no, they're way off.
It's not like 2%. It's like 70%.
But the kicker is the CBO is great at predicting GDP.
Yep.
And once you realize that it's GDP times 0.18, you're great at it now too. Because it literally takes nothing to figure this out. I'm math illiterate, and I could do that, right? And we told them that it was a very short conversation with those people. Right. I don't think they believed a word we told them. Yeah. But it bears right out. Matter of fact, the director of the Congressional Budget Office wrote to us and said, you're wrong. We just sent back 0.18. We're not. Yeah. You know, what can you do? But here's what happens when you bifurcate, when you look at outcome instead of principle, right? Because what's the outcome? Tax the rich, tax cuts for the rich. What's the principle? We have to raise the revenue. We have to raise the revenue.
And even before that, what do we owe each other?
Yeah, well, you have to answer that to figure out how much of a revenue you have to raise. But from there, it's actually not that hard.
But notice how the conversation would change if we started the principle. If we start the principle, okay, we owe each other something. The next logical question is, well, what is that? Well, I don't know what the right answer is, but historically at the federal level, it appears to be 18%. Okay, let's take 18%. We owe each other 18%. Now, look at what happens to our discussion of federal spending. All of a sudden, all this business about, I'll give you this free stuff if you elect me, it disappears. All of that debate. Why? Because we're constrained to 18% of GDP. So now the conversation becomes, okay, I'll give you free college, but I got to take away this thing because we owe each other 18%, not more. And now we get a much more robust conversation as a nation. It's no longer one group saying, well, clearly everybody should have health care, and if you don't think everybody should have health care, you just hate the elderly and the sick. And somebody else saying, but no, things don't fall for free out of the sky. You can't just wave a magic wand and say you want health care. You people have no idea how these things work. That conversation disappears, replaced with the conversation of, okay, we're going to have universal health care. It's going to cost this, which means we have to give up the following things. How do you feel about that trade-off? I'm not saying that that's an easy question to answer, but in quality, it's an extremely different conversation that no longer pits people together, each side thinking the other one is evil, but brings reasonable people together, understanding that there are trade-offs and we've got to weigh these things.
And when you start to look at it, the 18% figure, we just keep throwing it out there. The real thing is that it doesn't have to be 18%, right? And if you realize that you want a lot more collectively, well, you can get it. You just have to be honest and have a discussion and an argument about it. And then you have to carry the day. You have to prevail upon everybody else that you're right and they're wrong. Similarly, you could also decide as a people that 18% is far too onerous and you don't want to pay it anymore. And you'd rather pay next year 16%. And you can have that discussion over time too. So you get this dialectical possibility, right, where people actually take politics seriously again without name calling. This is generally speaking why Ant and I are very much in favor of a flat tax. And our negotiation with each other comes, do we want a flat tax or a flat tax with a single exemption, right, which is definitionally not flat anymore. It's just mostly flat, right? But then if we were to move to this, politicians would only have 2 data points to manipulate, which means they couldn't complicate the tax code to buy your vote, which means they'd have to tell the truth. And you look for institutional answers to these human problems. It's always the right thing, right? Those of you, I know one of my former students is here, and he knows in his heart I'm going to talk about James Harrington and the Commonwealth of Oceania now. And Harrington says, imagine 2 silly girls with a piece of cake. And he said, they both want more of the cake than they'll give to the other. Well, that's easy. Give one the knife and allow the other to pick the piece she wants. One cuts, the other chooses. And it all, and from 2 people, deeply self-interested, probably with bad motives, you get a perfectly just outcome. Institutionally, that's made possible. So what we're looking for very typically are institutional answers to human problems that make these sort of outcomes even probable rather than possible.
We want to open it up to Q&A. Before we do that, I want to give you a piece of advice that you might find useful. I found it useful in dealing with hate mail. What I find is people, generally it's people from the left, although we do on occasion hit a nerve of people on the right, and we get hate mail from them as well. They're both equally capable of writing hate mail. But one of the approaches I've taken to dealing with this that you may find useful is somebody writes and says, you're an idiot, you're wrong because of the following things.
They were right with the first assertion.
Right. Don't respond to the you are an idiot thing. In fact, pretend the person didn't write it. Look through the email for things that the person said that are not ad hominem, that they're actual arguments. And you might find that they're not very good arguments. So bolster them, make them better. And I'm saying writing, you would be talking perhaps, but when you communicate back with the person, say, okay, here's what I heard you say, and lay out the person's argument for them. Not in a disingenuous way. Give them the strongest argument you can. And what you will find, what I've found in virtually 99% of the cases, the people write back, and it's if it's a different person I'm talking to. It's a human being who's communicating with me and saying, okay, I heard you about this, but what about this? And can we find some common ground there? All the ad hominem is gone. And I think if you connect with the person as as a human being, and you're going to have to take the first step to do it, don't respond to the ad hominem. They almost invariably will respond in kind, and you'll have a constructive conversation. That's not to say that you'll end up convincing the person, but at the very least, the person will walk away having a greater respect for people like you who have these kinds of opinions.
It's funny. If some of you listen to our podcast, I'm sure you all should. You should all subscribe on multiple devices. We got to get our numbers up. But at the end, Anthony gives our email address, and I always say, don't write, don't write, don't write. Because here's what nobody actually knows. Anthony answers every single piece of hate mail. Every single one, and he CCs me on it. which I don't really care for. I don't mind that he does it, I just don't need to see the sausage getting made on this one. And because there's a 3-hour time difference, and I'm 3 hours behind in Arizona, and he wakes up 4 hours earlier than I do, even when we're in the same time zone, sometimes I wake up and there's 40 or 50 responses and a back and forth in my inbox. But I have to say, he's right. I don't say this often, but Ant is right. When he responds, they become very rational. Very, very rational. And they actually become decent. And I've actually seen a couple even apologize for the ad hominems. Which, if you've lived with the internet for even 20 minutes, that's like a pterodactyl sighting, right? I mean, you actually saw someone apologize for words he said on the internet. So this idea of principle, it seems like a very long road to walk, and it seems like it's probably not going to be terribly fruitful. And maybe in the aggregate, that's the better, more realistic way to look at it. But when you look at it on an individual level, what you see everywhere you see it are people who can actually be reasoned with, and people who are happy to be reasoned with, and people who become quite reasonable. And what's the aggregate but a collection of individual observations, right? So over time, we may well be able to shift things here, but it's incumbent upon us to actually never cede the high ground. And the high ground seems to require our being nice to one another, even when there's no earthly reason to be nice to one another. Or when it's at least fabulously difficult.
And keep in mind as well, you may perceive the conversation you're having is your conversation with whoever this is. Always remember you're one in a great community. And that person you're talking to will go away and end up interacting with another one of us. And if you can let that person walk away from you without disrespecting you and without you disrespecting them, even if they don't agree with you, you lay a little bit of groundwork, you make it easier for the next one of us who talks to that person. And it may take 5, 6, 10, 20 of us talking to that person before the person comes around and says, yeah, okay, I can see this argument and I buy it. But we don't get to that 20th person unless the previous 19 are respectful.
On that happy note, we've talked far too much. So, yes, sir. We're both kind of deaf. Okay. So just make sure it's from the diaphragm, because sure. We talk to each other like two old ladies as we drive down the road. Right?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a little over 100 years ago, we implemented the income tax in this country. And I was wondering if your analysis extended back before the time of the federal income tax. Did the 18% hold true even before we had a federal income tax?
Yeah, that's a good question. And two answers. The first answer is the data does not go back that far, or at least once you pass prior to 1950, 1940, the data becomes very sketchy in terms of quality. So I can't answer that part of the question. What I can say is that if you look at federal spending, now it's not federal revenue, but you would imagine they're probably not too far off. Federal spending prior to the Great Society, 1950s, or I guess prior to 1930.
28, you get the big spike.
Federal spending was around 5%, certainly less than 10% of GDP, and now we're up to 22%. And you can see, you can look at this graph from 1798. It's humming along at 5%. You get bumps during wartime, and it comes right back down, about 5% of GDP, until you hit 1930s. and then it goes like this.
Yeah, it comes directly out of the progressive movement, right? So about a generation after Herb Crowley writes The Promise of American Life, you can actually see the 20-year gap and the explosion. And by the time, 1944 or so, when Franklin Roosevelt presents the second Bill of Rights, the Economic Bill of Rights, if you look at federal spending mapped against GDP, you can see that by the time he's telling everybody what we're going to do next, it's clear that we've already had the sea change in our attitude. And it really happened 15 years prior to that. So yeah, the data's just squishy back then. My guess would be we didn't collect even close to 18% of GDP back then.
Oh, no,
Not
no.
even close.
I would be surprised it was more than 5%.
Yeah, I would too.
Thank you.
Sir.
I'm wondering if you guys think, because people say that discourse is getting worse and coarser and more boring forever. And I'm wondering if you think that's true, like looking historically, is it actually getting worse than it was before, or is the internet just sort of amplifying how bad it is?
You want this one?
Go ahead.
Okay. I don't know, but that last thing you said is the interesting bit, right? The internet is an amplifier. And worse than that, it's an amplifier that offers anonymity. So you can have bad actors literally everywhere. And how to put this? I'm a big, scary man. I am, I know this. My mother used to tell me, right? It's okay. And yet, people will say things on Twitter to me that they wouldn't dare say if they were standing next to me, right? And beyond that, they say things to me on Twitter that if they had to look me in the eye, they would never say. Because I know that underneath it all, those are decent people too. They're just operating under different rules of a different, very strange game that we collectively haven't quite figured out yet. And I've been wondering a lot lately, and is probably why it's on my mind now. I've just been wondering a lot lately if we need a pressure valve socially, and that has just come to be it, that we seem to know that we can go to certain places and mistreat each other horribly without repercussion and without a lot of harm either, right? Because, all right, people become offended and people get legitimately hurt, but more or less, this might be better than the good old days when you'd get a punch in the mouth for these sorts of things, right? Which was a different kind of harm. So I don't know, right? People, when I meet young people, and Ant and I tour high schools every year, a number of them, and I can tell you without question, and we agree on this, that the students we meet in high schools are sweet and kind and decent, much more so than when we were in high school. So we've got, what, about a 30 or 35-year lag on that now? I guess we are old. And I remember meeting my college students when I first started teaching, and I thought, you guys are jerks. And I think they're nicer now. Now, do I think they're better all the way around? No, I think they're softer, they're resistant to criticism, right? These sorts of things. Their mothers come and yell at me in my office, right? It happens. But on balance and overall, I think they're better. So, it seems that I'm giving you two completely different answers here. But underneath them, they may be the same answer, right? Because I don't know what we're going to end up thinking about our human behaviors in light of this new technology in 40 years. I suspect we'll have it sorted out by then, right? But for now, it's a bit of a free-for-all, and it's ugly. It's ugly.
Could you comment on the problem of confirmation bias and how focusing on principles helps address that?
Yeah, the confirmation bias problem, of course, is we look for evidence to support our position. And one of the nice things about focusing on principle is that principle comes before the observation. So you ask yourself, what is fundamentally true? You've got some topic you want to debate. What is the core principle? Minimum wage, for example. Do we own ourselves? Do you own yourself? If the answer is yes, then that implies various things. And if you go down that path, you end up at the conclusion of no, minimum wage is contradictory to this principle. But notice what you haven't done as you're grappling with this question of do you own yourself. You haven't asked, what's happened when the minimum wage has gone up? Have people earned more? Have people earned less? Now, that's where the confirmation bias can come in, because if I start looking around, I'll naturally, even subconsciously, pick results that match my conclusion. I'm not even there yet. I'm asking the principal. And not in every case, but in many cases, the principle will lead you to a conclusion that is agnostic to the evidence. For example, if you agree that we own ourselves, each individual owns his or her own self, then the conclusion is there can be no minimum wage, or a minimum wage is in opposition to that. It doesn't matter whether minimum wage is empirically good or empirically bad. You've answered the question.
Of course, if you've answered the question in the same way, you probably have funny outlooks on things like prostitution, organ sales, drug use, suicide laws. It's going to add up, right? And this is the difficulty. This is always the difficulty.
And we find this on both the left and the right. People will, on both sides, maintain opinions that are contradictory. For example, minimum wage is bad, but prostitution is bad also. Well, they both flow from the same core principle. Do you own yourself or not? If you do, then no, we should not have minimum wage, but prostitution should be legal.
Maybe we've just got the principle wrong and you don't own yourself.
Maybe you do have the principle, but if you don't own yourself, then it's the other way around.
Yeah.
That you should have the minimum wage, and yes, prostitution should be illegal. But notice where the conversation sticks. Do you own yourself? You can't move forward until you've addressed that question.
And confirmation bias is sticky business, right? Because we all wake up knowing a few things. And I'm no different, and yet when Ant and I write, I'll often, in the middle of it, we talk on Zoom a lot, so we talk face to face. It makes a difference. And I usually talk to him first thing in the morning and then again in the afternoon, which for him is afternoon and evening. And we get the work set up for the day, and then by the evening, the work is about done, and I finish it off, and he revises it the next morning before I wake up, and this is the workflow. But usually at some point during that flow, I stop and I look at him, and I don't even know if you notice this, but I always say the same thing. What am I not seeing? It's like this mantra. And I'll say this in business meetings all the time. What am I not seeing? What am I not getting? Understanding that in some non-trivial way, I probably decided what the correct answer was before I started this. And I'm relying on you to disabuse me of that if you think I'm wrong. Because if you can prevail upon me that I'm wrong, then it's incumbent upon me to rethink it. And I will. But I can't until I know. And sometimes we talk ourselves out of knowing. And back on the minimum wage thing, you can find a small handful of studies on either side of this issue that absolutely prove whatever point you want. Mm-hmm. And there's more of them that prove that minimum wage is helpful and not harmful. Right? No, more studies prove it. I'm not saying it's true. But if you look at it, every one of them looks at only food service industry workers. Mm-hmm. Well, those aren't minimum wage workers. Those are food service industry workers, right? There's all kinds of bias right there. And one of the things I tell my students is, look, don't argue with me if and when you do about the last thing I say. Argue with me when I walk into a room and I say, can't we all stipulate? Don't we agree? Isn't it clearly true that? Because that's when I'm coming for you. Right? I'm coming for you then. And the minute you agree with me at that point, trust me, I've already thought the rest through. You haven't, I've already won. Right? So always watch out. But a lot of the times when I say those things, I mean them. When I say, can't we all agree? I think we probably should, right? And that's my bias too. We all have it, so you have to find some way to get around your own, and that's really difficult.
So we started out this session by talking about abortion, and I was just wondering, so the principle is that you should have control over your own body. So then, how do you assess the kind of contradiction it poses when the right believes that the unborn child is a human being, and then that would be them not controlling their own body, or that the left
For obvious reasons, I want to avoid the topic.
But let me, I'll take this one.
No, well, let me tell you where. Let me tell you the principle I believe the answer hinges on, as opposed to what I believe the answer is. The answer I believe, the principle the answer hinges on, has nothing to do with whether you do or do not own your own body. That's a question that comes after this principle. The principle is, at what point in a human's development does the human acquire natural rights? If you can answer that question, you've answered the abortion question.
I would make it more simple. I would just say, at what point does whatever this thing is become human?
Right.
And nice and simple, right? And then what you see is that we're operating under two pretty good principles, right? Both sides. One is saying a woman should have the right to choose the contours and quality of her own life. Yeah, I agree. The other is saying human beings should not be killed. Yeah, I agree. But I don't know, and nobody else does either, as near as I can tell, when human life begins. Thus, we have this probably for a time, and maybe for all time, an insoluble problem. And that's where we're left. And insoluble problem, I don't use that word lightly. I know what insoluble means, and this may be insoluble. And there's evidence for that, right? We're still arguing about it hard, in a mean-spirited, vicious sort of way,
Well, I mean,
all these years later. And we argued about it prior to Roe versus Wade. Make no mistake. This was a big issue before that, too.
And it's mean-spirited because we aren't arguing the principle. We're arguing the implications that come several steps after the principle.
And we're not arguing each other's principle either, right? I just said that I think both principles are actually quite good. They're just a level or two down from where they need to be in order to get some sort of resolution. But to get some sort of resolution, you're going to have to prevail. One group will have to prevail upon the other that they have a correct answer, which means argument and evidence, right? It's always the same: assertion, argument, evidence, conclusion. And assertions are really easy. Arguments, okay. Evidence, I don't see it here. I'm long on argument and I'm short on evidence. So as long as that's true, I think I can more or less predict that we're going to remain at loggerheads over this one until some part of that process changes. I don't know where it's going to be or what it's going to be. I actually appreciate deeply both sides of the argument. I don't appreciate at all most of the people who make either one of them. And that's where we're kind of left. And Ant and I have steadfastly avoided this topic, although we talk about it more and more now that it becomes a hot button issue, shockingly, roughly 18 months before the next big election. They may be related, I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility. But we'll see. But we understand it is a principal issue, and it'd be better if everybody else understood that too, but I'm not going to hold my breath on it, right? We're probably just going to disagree for a while.
I believe that living in a society and having a government is really valuable. It's so valuable that I would be willing to pay for it voluntarily. I bristle at the word owe because it implies a debt. And I don't believe that I've indebted myself to society. Can you explain what you mean when you say I owe something?
Yeah, I've been working with O a lot lately because people have been coming after me exactly the way you just did. And I think that's, I think it's reasonable and warranted, right? I think that's right. And the next thing I want to do is actually get into the etymology of certain words like O, because owner, I bet that comes from the same root. And that wouldn't be exactly right? So there's probably a better word. I don't know what it is. I've got some candidates up there that I'm not willing to talk about yet because they may turn out to be bone-chillingly stupid. But look, the point you get at here is exactly right. Is society a voluntary association? Yeah, it seems to be. If Aristotle has a point flowing through, even the social contractarians have to make it voluntary. Right? It's an agreement that we all come to, right? This kind of thing. Of course, there never was a social contract, and that causes some problems. And no matter how you look at it, you're always left with the problem of ongoing consent, right? Are we going to agree to this every 20 years like Jefferson wanted? That seems silly. That seems like it's going to be a problem. So I don't know. There's no clear answer here. And the more you trace back the American heritage, the more you realize this has been an ongoing problem. So James Otis, in the writs of assistance case in 1760 in Boston, said taxes exist only to raise the revenue. Taxes are a voluntary gift given by the people. Parliament is omnipotent. See if you can find the flaw in the thinking. And there you go, right? And we've been working with one form or another of that problem ever since. And then we complicate that by adding to the list of responsibilities for government. So whatever taxation is at root, and I know somebody in here wants to stand up and shout taxation is theft right now. And whatever it is at root, we've complicated matters exponentially, because without figuring out the principle, we've walked down the road of policymaking, and you know that that's going to come back on you sooner or later. And how do you know that? Well, we run 25% deficit. Right now we spend 25% more than we take in. And there's all kinds of public choicey arguments you can make to explain this, and I think they're actually rather good and rather explanatory. But I think it really comes from this misunderstanding of the thing itself, no real agreement. Would society function as a voluntary thing? Yeah, I don't know either. Tom Paine bifurcated government and society in his thinking and said people conflate the two. That's a mistake. They're not the same. Society is a blessing, government, even in its best case, a curse, but a necessary one. And that's always the problem, right? Reasonable people can say that sort of thing. And then I think at best, they're probably right. And how do you fund that? I don't know. Is it going to work on voluntary grounds? We don't see any evidence of it. And more to that, we don't see evidence of power vacuums. So then your question becomes, are we better off admitting that we're going to have this and trying to control it, or are we better off admitting we don't need this and trying not to have it?
Along these lines, a principle you might find very useful in discussing with particularly social justice issues, and of course with people on the left, is the principle of subsidiarity, which is I've found it really popular in two places, oddly. One is Catholic social thought, and the other is the social justice movement. But subsidiarity, libertarian type, should be embracing this. It's a principle that governing should be done at the lowest possible level. So if there's a problem that local government can handle, state government should not be touching it. State government only comes in when the local government can't handle it. And by extension, the federal government only comes in when the state government can't handle it, which is the exact opposite way we tend to govern. We see a problem, we immediately run to Washington and ask them to impose our preferred solution on everybody. The nice thing about subsidiarity is you have greater accountability because the decision makers, the government, the politicians are much closer to the people at subsidiarity. You also have what you started your question with, voluntary relationship. I can move. If I don't like how Pittsburgh is handling its governance, I can leave. I can go somewhere else. And be very careful about the idea that, well, cities are small, what can they do? Cities today are larger than most countries have been throughout the history of humanity. I would argue that cities could probably handle everything save some environmental issues that can't be contained within the geographic boundaries, and national defense.
Ant says subsidiarity, but I keep telling him he needs to learn the word federalism because we had this for a bit.
Yeah, but the word that's going to attract your listeners is subsidiarity.
Yeah, but federalism more or less disappears after a couple of problems that we had. But really, when you look at the data, disappears at the same time the taxes really change as a function of GDP. So we're always looking at about 20 years after the introduction of progressive thought, one generation, give or take. And that's the mess that we live in. So when Ant says that the social justice folks are more interested in subsidiarity, I would say no, this is exactly because they weren't. That they tried to nationalize all kinds of things that they saw as matters of justice. And that gave us the social state that we now have. So I think there is some room for disagreement here.
Do you want to go to another question?
Yeah, please.
Going back to the social security issue, I'm curious to what you guys think the underlying principle of that is, because I think that we can all agree on the principle of it. I think that the discussion is almost the outcome, and I'm kind of struggling to. I'm just curious where you guys were going with that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my guess is you would find virtually everybody, minus a few people, would agree on the principle that as a society, we have a responsibility to care for those who cannot care for themselves. I'm not talking about those who choose not to care for themselves, but those who literally cannot care for themselves. And James has made this argument before. If you've got somebody, pick my sister, for example, was born severely mentally retarded. No way. Absolutely zero way.
Not allowed to say that anymore.
Is that not the word?
No, that's not.
I'm so sorry. What did you say?
I just did. Yes, there you go.
What is it?
Thank you.
Intellectual disability.
Yes.
Disability is not the right word.
It's not,
this was
but it's
gargantuan.
but it's way better than the one
Okay.
you used. Yeah.
Sorry.
Assume good.
Nonetheless.
Assume good faith.
Yeah.
It's okay.
But she was in a position, absolutely zero way that she could care for herself in any way whatsoever, even as much as getting out of a chair and going somewhere else, right? Now, James has made the argument, quite right. She has a family. The family should take care of her. Absolutely. But there will be cases in which there is no family, which are no neighbors. And as human beings, we can't allow our fellow human beings to just die because there's nobody around to help them. So that principle, I think, underlies that is what should underlie Social Security. The unfortunate thing is that principle applies to a vanishingly small number of people compared to what Social Security
But let's be
covers.
honest. Social Security is to also to make sure that old people don't starve to death, right, in their retirement. And I think we would all agree on that principle too. That's a pretty reasonable principle. And if we all stipulate that, well, then there's still the second question: how do we best facilitate that? This isn't necessarily the right answer. And I think long, torturous history has proven that this is not the right answer and will not be the right answer. I think the Social Security, the board of directors, they're saying 2026. If from that point forward it will cease to be the right answer. So you can expect that something horrible will happen between now and then to keep it the right answer. But Ant and I wrote an article about this, 2-3 days ago, I think it went up. There are ways you can get out of this, right, and still facilitate the same goal. Because if we agree on the principle, we should then only want that which satisfies the principle best. We shouldn't care whether it's this way or that way, as long as the ways don't violate some other principle. And I think I could show you 4 or 5 easy ways you could do better than Social Security and still facilitate the goal that we all agree on. And then path dependency comes along, right? We've got these kinds of problems. But I think it can be done. I don't know if you want to say any more about
I do
that
not.
here today.
I have a quick question. Have you had any experience interacting with people who just do not want to deal in the principle? Who say, oh, that's just an abstraction, and really drive to focusing on specific outcomes? Because I actually find myself in those conversations.
Yeah, those are hard conversations.
I think people say that all the time, but they never believe it. Everybody operates according to principle. Everybody.
Have you had any?
If you were a nihilist, you wouldn't get up in the morning and go out and do anything, right? Every human action implies better and worse. You're always choosing for better and worse. And then by what standard becomes the next question. And whatever the standard is, well, you're starting to inch ever closer to principle.
I have one friend who goes down that path, that he says, I believe we should have minimum wage. I point out how minimum wage violates other things he believes in. Not concerned about that. He's got his laundry list of these are the things he wants. And so finally, out of exasperation, I said, look, really what you want is to be dictator and just everything be whatever the menu is that you want, that's it. And he kind of nodded and he said, yeah, okay. So that's his foundational principle, that everything should be what Jeff wants. Now, you could argue that from all kinds of equality perspectives, but we finally honed in on his core principle. It has nothing to do with his menu. It had to do with the fact that he wants what he wants.
Is Jeff here?
No.
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
So we spoke a lot about principles and how important principles are, but it's evident that there can be confusion about what is the right principle
Right.
for whatever issue it is. So how do we know, are there telling signs of what is the right principle? And could the ambiguity and confusion about what is the right principle be the reason why people choose to use smart goals and outcomes instead?
Look, the ambiguity in principle is one of the reasons why I place such a high premium on human freedom, right? Because if we can't know, then our default position really should be, when it can be, leave people be, right? If we knew the exact right answer to every question, human freedom would cease to be much of a concern. But we don't. We just don't, right? And if you don't know, I mean, in the philosopher's language, if you don't know what the natural law requires of you, does it require anything of you? Well, now it gets kind of confounding, right? But human freedom does come and fill that void to some degree. And how well do we know anything? 3,000 years ago, Socrates said, yeah, you're going to have true opinion on the best of days. Right? You're not going to know much conclusively. You can know a few things, but that list is pretty small compared to what you can't know. And then as you live and you go through decade after decade, and it seems that you know less the longer you live, the harder you work, you just know less and less. Maybe leaving everybody else be is actually a principle that goes pretty high up the chain. That's where I fall down on this. It's actually why I became a libertarian. I don't really use that word. I call myself a classical liberal. I think that's much closer to correct in my case. But I just want everybody to have the fullest vision of freedom they can have, because who am I to tell them I'm right and they're wrong? I'm not sure of that in the least.
We have 3 minutes. We can take one more question.
I have a question with regard to the dilemma you mentioned with the prostitution versus minimum wage. Where do you think that the natural rights for that come from, and do you think that would play into the implications of that dilemma?
I'm happy to go with self-ownership. I think John Locke was absolutely right. I think the assertion that you own yourself is a wholly unremarkable assertion. Of course you own yourself. If you can't, who could? Now, the ancient Greeks might well have had a different answer to this, and certain other people do too. Nonetheless, I think it unremarkable. I think most of us think it unremarkable, but we're unwilling to trace that out because we find that we get what I call icky results. It's just gross if you do it, right? Because what's your name? David, if you own yourself and you decide on your way back to your room you're going to talk to the heroin dealer in the lobby and go shoot up when you get to your room, should I look the other way on that? Should we look the other way on that? And I might be able to give you two different answers, right? I might be able to say, morally, I should probably try to prevail upon you that this is not the best way to live. After that, I'm probably going to say that it is my belief that that is not the best way to live. And do I want to operationalize that in every instance? And probably not, right? So I'm willing to allow people to make dreadful mistakes with their own lives. And you get to things like the harm principle and things like this. Do you own yourself? Yeah, I think you do. Do certain things follow from that? Yep. Do we live up to those standards? Very poorly. Very, very poorly. And I think we should do a lot better, even when it yields outcomes we don't like. And that's really where it's at, right? Because the principle here, way more important than the individual outcomes, because the aggregate of the outcomes will be much, much better. I can still point to certain things that are going to be very problematic.
Yeah, I would say a little more simply that I would pose the question, what is the greater denigration on your humanity? Allowing you to engage in prostitution or drug use, understanding the badness here, or removing your free agency? I would argue the greater denigration on your humanity is my removing your free agency. That's not to say I approve of these other things, but they become all of a sudden the lesser of the evils.
On that happy note, I think
We
we're
got one question here.
We're out of time.
I wanted to just say, in addition to subscribing to Words and Numbers, their podcast on multiple devices, you should also listen to it.
You should listen to it. That's right. That's right.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.